Thank you, Asli. First of all, let me start by thanking you and the Nobel Symposium for including me in this. It's really been a treat, wonderful place to be, surprisingly beautiful and pleasant. And then on the topic of Islam, Muslims, and the path to peace, I'd like to start first by sharing with you just a few facts, random facts. One, you may have noticed that there's a recent upsurge in violence in the Muslim world. According to the International Institute of Strategic Studies Armed Conflict Database, total fatalities due to war is up by a factor of 4 times since 2010. In 2000, 35% of fatalities in wars were in conflicts involving Muslims. In 2014, that jumped to 79%. According to the START database, it's University of Maryland, the number of terrorist incidents went up 3.5 times between 2010 and 2014. In the same period, the number of fatalities rose 6 times. And finally, the percentage of fatalities caused by Islamic insurgency groups went up from 75% in 2006 to 90% in 2014. When you look at facts like this, you're going to say, okay, how do we explain that? An assertion that is heard most frequently is that this has nothing to do with the religion of Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. I also hear that all of this violence that officially are now named as violent extremism, really what lies at the bottom of that is socioeconomic. People are poor, there's poor governance, low education, and so please don't look for religious explanations. Do not link it to Islam. It's socioeconomic. You'll also hear, when discussing violence that is perpetrated in Western countries by people who invoke Islam, you will also hear that doesn't have that much to do with religion. The latest incident is in Orlando, Florida, but it has to do with Islamophobia. People are victims of discrimination. You hear this in France, you hear it in the United States of America, and so this is not, it is a reaction to that kind of discrimination. And also since 9/11, 2001, it's been commonplace for some in the academic and in the media arenas to say, well, this is also caused by for American foreign policy, US foreign policy. A little older than that, since 1989, is Professor Samuel Huntington, the late Professor Samuel Huntington, and his idea of a clash of civilizations. And I have to tell you, I'm one of the few people who really admire and in awe of Huntington's analytical mind. And I think that he did see something when he talked about a clash of civilizations. But what we are seeing really is there's also within Islam a clash of civilization. My own view is that the violence that we are witnessing cannot be separated, A, from Islam, and B, the way Muslim communities are evolving in their relationships with the West. I'll start by identifying, as opposed to defining, what Islam is. Islam is a system of worship. People pray, they fast, they believe in one God, they go to the Kaaba on pilgrimage. So there are a lot of features as Westerners, when you talk about religion and religion as it's described in many of these Western constitutions, there are so many aspects of that make Islam a religion. But Islam is also a political doctrine. And as a political doctrine, Islam prescribes how to govern, how society should live with one another. It prescribes divine law as opposed to man-made laws. And I'll get a little bit later to, the detailed description of that political doctrine, but it is a political doctrine. Islam is also a civilization and a culture 1,400 years old and encompasses a great geographical mass. For many today, in a globalizing world, Islam is a source of their identity. Not their only identity, but it is a source of one of their identities, with some stronger than others. When we talk about Islam as a religion, we think about observance of rituals, attire, and dietary restrictions belonging to a religious community. That is, you celebrate together issues of birth and death. The symmetry should be Islamic specifically. Islam has tribal and clan features that in many ways also correspond with Islamic practices. What Islam is not is that it is not a race. People who identify as Muslims are of all, I think of humanity as one race, but if I allow myself to be as intellectually lazy as the mainstream, I'll say, well, Muslims are of all races, of all skin tones, and speak all the languages of the world. They are also of different social backgrounds. Some are rich and some are poor. Some of them come from the center of what was an Islamic civilization or an Islamic empire, and some come from the periphery. So to say, I come from Somalia, that belongs to the periphery, but if you're from Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Egypt, that might be described by some scholars as the centers of Islam or the heartlands of Islam. So what Islam is not a race, and that is why I think the term Islamophobia is problematic. Now, to go back to Islamic law. Islamic law prescribes a system of government. It's a political philosophy. And I'm a student of political science and did a little bit about political philosophy. And so if you ask me, where would you rank? I would put it in the realm of political theory, and I would advise all major universities today not only to teach about Western political philosophy, which is what I took at Leiden, but to teach Islam also as a political philosophy that competes with other political philosophies. There's a term called the Ummah, or the people. So who is the constituency of Islam? The assumption in Islamic political doctrine is all Muslims. And that assumption, if you look at the Ummah from a religious perspective, then it's the way you would look at Christianity, all Muslims. But if you look at it as a political perspective, Islam ignores nation states and rejects nation states, because anyone who is a Muslim from the political perspective is to be seen to be under Islamic rule. And in the past, at least until the end of the Ottoman Empire, there was the political leader. And in many ways, back then, there were various political leaders. But the Ummah sees itself as answering to the deputy of Allah or God in their political reality, and that's the caliph or the caliphate. That doesn't exist. I think as many of us don't, I do not recognize Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, now as the caliph. Neither do most Muslims. But you can imagine what he's pretending to be. It's also a legal system called Sharia, or Islamic law. It has institutions and it has rules. Now, there are many things that I would say when you want to relate Islam to peace, many things that are an obstacle to the path to peace when you take Islamic doctrine. But the most salient of that is jihad, or holy war. And when you look at the literature, what you're going to see is that jihad is described in different ways. It's an inner struggle against your own self, and that is, so Muslims are told, praying 5 times a day and fasting in the month of Ramadan is not as easy as you think. So trying to get yourself to the self-discipline when you observe all these rituals, that would be your inner jihad. I saw in the United States of America some people who were saying, well, it's an inner struggle. For instance, if you want to get yourself to the gym 3 or 4 times a day, that would be called my inner jihad. I don't think that definition of jihad is an obstacle to peace. Then there's jihad al-shaitan, jihad against Satan. And jihad against Satan is if question marks pop into your head about some of the absolute prescriptions of Islam, you should then think of these question marks as being inspired by Satan. And that's, again, another inner struggle. So reject these doubts. Do not ask questions, just follow. That may or may not be an obstacle to jihad. When we have our discussion, we'll get to it. Then there's jihad against the infidel or the kafir. That definitely is, I would say, a great or perhaps the greatest obstacle to the path to peace when it comes to Islam and Muslims. And then there's another one that is little spoken of, which is jihad against the hypocrites. So this is a jihad or war against Muslims who are deemed in their belief not to be true, to be hypocritical. And that also is an obstacle to the path to peace. Let me move a bit. Now I come to the second point, which is if that is Islam, and again, I haven't given you a complete description of what Islam is. We'll get to it as we discuss. But the next question is, what about Muslims? If Islam is a doctrine and a system of belief, what about Muslims? Muslims are the adherents, the individuals who believe. And the way we now classify them in the media, in mainstream academia, is there are moderates and there are extremists, or there are fundamentalists and there are moderates, whatever you want to call them. And I think those classifications are not helpful at all. I think that in order to understand who is inspired and who aspires to jihad against hypocrites and jihad against infidels is to read what they're saying. And I have come, in my latest book, Heretic, I've decided that a more helpful classification is one where you see those who really want to focus on the political aspect of Islam when they invoke the Holy Quran and when they invoke Muhammad. They almost always point to the period in Medina. So Muhammad founded the religion in Mecca. In the first 10 years he was preaching, and then he goes to Medina the next 10 years, and that is symbolic. It's called Hijrah. It's a great moment when Muhammad then starts not only to become a preacher, but he becomes a militiaman, he becomes a general, he becomes a lawmaker. And so anyone today who invokes Medina and Muhammad in that period, I think a better label for them would be Medina Muslims. And we'll get into the Medina worldview. But let me go to the second category of Muslims. There are Muslims, and I think they are the majority, who see themselves as religious adherents. They may have political issues, they may be violent or not violent, but they do not use Islam as a tool of conflict. And I describe those as Mecca Muslims. So someone will pray, fast, or maybe not even observe at all, but identify as a Muslim. And if at any time they invoke the Prophet or the Quran, they invoke only what happened in Mecca and what the Prophet Muhammad said in Mecca. And there is a third and very interesting group that I call the modifiers or the reformers, who are challenging the Medina Muslims. And they're challenging them from a theological perspective and a political perspective, and they're saying, what you Medina guys are preaching, that is a road to nihilism, and it's a road to perpetual war. We reject that. And we want to reform and leave some of these problematic aspects that are an obstacle to peace. We want to leave it behind and read it in a historical context. So within Islamic discourse and within the Islamic civilization, there, I think, the most interesting forces are the Medina versus the modifying forces. And who are they trying to influence first and foremost? The mass of Mecca Muslims. Okay, now let me get to the worldview of the Medina Muslims. Because as I see it, the Medina Muslims are the biggest obstacle to peace between Muslims and non-Muslims. Their worldview is binary. There is the House of Islam and there's the House of War. They see it as their project to bring so the non-Muslim or Muslims who do not share in that project, to bring them to the House of Islam. Not all of them are violent. There are, within that Medina group who want to bring everyone to the House of Islam, there are the gradualists. There are those who say we have to work within the systems and institutions of the prevailing power of today. And through that very gradual, slow process, we will be able, over time, over many generations, to persuade non-Muslims to come to Islam or to accept Islamic supremacy, or somehow, at some point, to get to that end goal when the whole world is under the Islamic banner. The other side of the Medina Muslims are the revolutionaries. They're the ones who say, oh no, we have to do it now, and we have to use violence, and their violence is not random. So a lot of people here think that what happened in Orlando is some crazy guy who got a gun and started shooting people, or what happened in Paris is another random act of violence. It is not. It's political violence. It is calculated, and at times it is centralized, and at times it's decentralized. But what they share is the worldview that through violence, we can get to that end game much faster. And it's been tried. This explains ISIS. How many minutes do I have left?
As many as you'd like.
No, I don't think that's fair. Okay, so that is the worldview of the Medina Muslims. And in that worldview, they are obviously the big obstacle to peace. Then the next question you ask yourself is, who are these Medina Muslims? And what you're going to find is that they are nation states, disturbingly. There are organizations and movements, and then there are individuals, loose individuals who are inspired by or sympathize with the movements. Nation states, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even though they compete, they have the same end goal, but they do compete for followers. These nation states are organized in, countries as a bloc. Many of them have a seat at the United Nations, and they are the Organization of Islamic Conference. This was established in 1969, and in 1969 they set out a mission, and this was a gradualist mission to Islamize fast Muslim societies, because they felt that Islam as a system of government and as a political doctrine was marginalized, and so they wanted to bring that back as central to Muslim societies, and then to expand outside of that. Islamic movements that are Medina-oriented, again, you can take these movements and divide them into violent, or rather revolutionaries, and the gradualists. The Muslim Brotherhood, the International Muslim Brotherhood, is one that I would say started out as a revolutionary organization and then morphed into, and it's Sunni, morphed into a more gradualist, and understood we have to work within the system to get anywhere. There's Hizb ut-Tahrir, there's Jama'at al-Islamiyah. And what you will notice with all of these movements is each of them either started on the path of da'wah, gradualism, and then becomes revolutionary, or the other way around. What is interesting about the Muslim Brotherhood is it's the progenitor of Al-Qaeda. And there's this big dispute, and there's this huge correspondence that's now being analyzed between the leadership within that Muslim Brotherhood, who then break away and become revolutionaries, because it's just taking far too long. And they always get a setback. And if you go to the Arab Spring, you will see what al-Zawahiri is saying to the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood when Morsi is removed from office. Look, you wanted to work within the system. This is what comes of it. The revolutionary path is the better path to Islam, to Islamic law, to their end goal. So those are the movements, the revolutionaries, the gradualists. There's only one movement that I would say so far that has actually acquired state power, and that is Khomeini's movement. Ayatollah Khomeini had been preaching for a long time, worked within the system, and then I think he pulled a peaceful revolution and turned Iran into an Islamic, Shia Islamic theocracy. Aside from that, I would say there have been very small successes for these Medina Muslims. There is the Taliban that temporarily controlled a territory. Now there is ISIS that controls pieces of Syria and pieces of Iraq. There's Boko Haram that has really never had proper state power, but for a while tried and continues to try to gain power through violence. And I think I'm forgetting Mali. The Islamist revolutionaries in Mali, for a very brief period, got their way and thought that they had state power. Aside from that, between the fall of the Ottoman Empire until now, there is really only one successful Sunni project, and that is the Saudi project. And you know how Saudi formation was very, very bloody, much bloodier, I would say, than ISIS at the moment, and came to power through the path of revolutionary violence, and then once in power, established a system where there is the House of Al Saud, the Caliph or the custodian of Mecca and Medina, and then a marriage, I would say, of convenience with the clergymen, and the clergymen determine and in fact see to it that Saudi Arabia remains in the path, narrow path of Sharia. Why do I find the Medina project the most interesting? First of all, it's not only an obstacle to the path to peace for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, but once that project, once their worldview and their philosophy is established, what you see is a systematic violation of human rights. Repression within and aggression to the outside. Now, in my conclusion, it is not all Muslims are committed to Sharia law. Not all Muslims are committed to jihad. Maybe most Muslims don't even understand what jihad is. A majority of Muslims may be Mecca Muslims. There is a small and significant growing number of modifiers, people who really want to separate religion from politics. But then we have to contend with the Medina Muslims. And the only way for Muslims to take back their religion and their civilization from the Medina Muslims is to reform it. The only way for outsiders, for non-Muslims, to contend with the Medina Muslims is to fight them, not only militarily, because we've only been doing militarily, not only through law enforcement on a domestic level, but to fight them in the battlefield of ideas. Thank you.
Some very interesting thoughts there. We'll just go straight to it. Nassim Taylor, go first.
I have, thanks, it's a great broad distinction, Medina, Mecca, particularly that we suspect that in Mecca, Muhammad was taking this dictation spite of Khomeini, in spite of the buzz, it's more like a revolution against the Shah or something. And we can see them in Lebanon, the way they treated Christian minorities in Syria. I mean, just the way the Iranians have behaved betrays complete night and day. You know, when I see a Sunni in Lebanon, I'm scared. All right. When I see a Shiite, I'm relaxed. So basically, and that's something that's an instinct that was formed over 1,300 years. Okay. I mean, actually, the Sunnis and the Shiites were originally actually from Lebanon, and they're the one who largely converted in the 16th century the Iranians. So this is one comment I want to make just to avoid trying to put because there's a lot of hope of Iranians, you know, becoming Westerns, particularly once they get over their inferiority complex with America. They can get over it, particularly especially after the few more people die. That's my comment.
I think that's a useful comment, Nassim. And so, number one, you're absolutely right that Shias, contemporary Shias and contemporary Sunnis are as different as day and night. And one of the things, and so in my book and in my talks, I do make a distinction between, say, Iran and the rest of the Sunni world. There is a joke that goes around now that in Iran it's only the regime members that believe in Islam, and that everybody else doesn't. But it's a joke. But Shia Islam is different. First of all, there was the theological split, historical theological split, and the Sunni Puritans, especially the Wahhabi branches, reject the Shia because the Shia have incorporated a lot of what you now call paganism and a lot of local cultures and superstitions into their practice of Islam. Second point is there are two types of scholarships on the subject of Islam. One is the age-old scholarship where you take the sources, Islamic sources, and you study them. So there's the biography of Muhammad, there's the Quran, there's the Hadith, there's what Muslims say, and then you study that and you analyze that. And then the other one is, I would say, recent, much newer, 1960s, maybe 1970s, started by John Wansborough in the University of Cambridge in the UK, who says, let's study Islam using outside sources. And that scholarship is very young, extremely exciting. There's the contention, for instance, I mean, if you're using the Islamic sources, you can't ask the question, did Muhammad exist? Or you can't ask the question, who wrote the Quran? But if you're doing this other scholarship, Quran scholarship, so you're basically applying Bible scholarship to the Quran and to Islam, you're going to start asking questions like who was Muhammad? Where did he come from? Did he exist? And you start to try dating things, and you get into the Aramaic and Syriac and other sources. And it's exciting because a lot of what is in Islamic sources is contested. But talking of the path to peace, it is not one of the easiest projects in the world. And already the outcomes, they've uncovered coins that had on them Muhammad, there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, but that predated Muhammad by a century or two. So it starts to get really, really exciting. Patricia Crone, Michael Cook started to contend, well, there's this, the spice route, and the spice route as it's dated in the Muslim narrative is really not even geographically possible and environmentally possible. So the Islamic narrative, the Muslim source narrative, is challenged by this, and I have to say countries like Saudi Arabia have done absolutely everything they can to shut that down. But there is still a small group in Germany working under pseudonyms who continue to dig and delve into it. But regardless of that, I mean, 1.6 billion, 1/5 of humanity, believe in the Muslim rendering of this story. And so that's what we have to work with in terms of conflict and peace.
If I may, I would like to weigh in here. I have a few questions for you. Could you please explain to us why some Muslim societies are decidedly peaceful and relatively stable and also even tolerant, and some some are not. And if you will, could you please make a comment on clans and traditions as perhaps an entry point into that? My second question is, why is it, to your mind, that at a time of European history where we are, to a greater extent than at any time before, defining ourselves by values, why do so many people find it difficult to confront intolerance when it comes from this particular direction?
So as far as the second question is concerned, I think we'll have to get a Euro expert to answer that. But I can try and I can make an attempt. The first question, why are some Muslim societies decidedly peaceful and decidedly tolerant while others are not? There are many different reasons for that, the economic, social, historical, and cultural. But one feature that in the recent past, especially since the resurgence of political Islam, is that where political Islam takes root, conflict arises. Where political Islam is limited or it hasn't taken root, then conflict is there, because as with all humans, we always have conflict, but it is not religious. Examples. Take a place like Indonesia and Malaysia. These are non-Arab countries. So I wanted to make that point also about Arab and non-Arab countries. By the way, it relates also to the clan tribal thing. Indonesia and Malaysia were famously more tolerant than most Muslim societies. But in the 1980s and 1990s, as political Islam is exported to them from the Middle East by Arabs, what you see is two developments: a grassroots rise in intolerance toward religious minorities, a subjugation of women. There was no female genital mutilation in Indonesia in recorded history, I'm told, until the Muslim Brotherhood comes from Egypt and introduces that, and now it's become almost commonplace in a place like Indonesia. Malaysia has just adopted, or is said to start adopting aspects of Sharia law. So grassroots, and that grassroots is, it's an outcome of da'wah, or the infrastructure of da'wah, the Islamization, grassroots Islamization, establishing mosques and Islamic centers in places where Muslims they identify as Muslim, but they are apolitical. That's what I would call the Mecca Muslims. And the Medina Muslims take root and they start to spread it. And then on the second level is top-down, where through the OIC and membership through the OIC countries, they commit to these Islamization projects. And I think in the early days, some of these countries would sign and attend all these meetings and say, okay, we're going to establish Sharia law, put it in one ear, take out the other ear. But recently, as Saudi Arabia is starting to tie, and some of the richer Gulf countries are tying price tags to what they do, they're seeking an outcome that shows Islamization. And so we're seeing that development, which is not good. Clan and tribalism. Islam was founded, according to the Muslim narrative, Islam was founded in an Arab tribal desert setting. And some of these tribal practices and customs and beliefs were later incorporated into the Sharia. And unfortunately, some of these features, if you look at other tribal societies, well, humanity was all tribal in the beginning, wasn't it? But over time, as nation states come around, empires rise, and you name it, many societies have lost their tribal character or have seen their tribal character weaken. With Islamic law, what it has done is it has taken some of these tribal aspects and it's made them timeless. So for a while you'll see that, say, stoning for adultery, pretty much a tribal practice. Societies abandon that, they don't do that for a while. And then the Medina Muslims come, establish Sharia law, and stoning begins over and over again. And so this is, I think there is a synergy between tribal, especially Arab tribal practices and Sharia law.
Thank you. Christian Skadevich.
Yes, I very much enjoyed the talk. I have two questions. The first one has to do with intra-Muslim fighting. So you cited a series of numbers suggesting that there was an increase in conflict in Muslim countries. And my guess would be that quite a large share of that would be intra-Muslim fighting,
Yes.
particularly the Syrian war. So I guess my question here is, to what extent do you think that these are due to doctrine? There could also be competing explanations that would point to that the Sunni-Shia split is driven more by regional rivalry between, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is then fueling proxy wars in places like Yemen. Now, my second question, I guess, goes to that if you try to look at analysis with Christianity, you could think of the 30 Years' War as being a conflict against competing religious doctrines. And arguably, the end outcome of that was that the actors saw the war was destructive, and they agreed on some system of non-confessional state foundation. Do you think that that kind of future is possible in Muslim countries at all, or is it simply something that's incompatible with political Islamic doctrine?
So you mean reform and enlightenment?
Yeah. Or could war drive reform through the consequence of war?
Through the consequence of war, yeah. So the first one, intra-Islamic fighting or intra-Muslim fighting. Again, many Muslims fight, and fight because of resources, because of cultural differences. A lot of them do because of honor and shame, so immaterial but very important reasons, and do not invoke religion. They don't invoke Islam in their intra-fighting. If you look at the most recent conflicts, the Arab Spring, the main conflict in Tunisia, in Egypt, in the Arab Spring countries was not at all religious. It was against the dictatorship, these dictatorships and these autocrats, and it was, I would say it was a desire for more freedom where some of the leaders of the protests felt that it was time to shake off this dictatorship. If you look at the people who are then demonstrating, some of them are communists, some of them are socialists, some of them are Muslim believers, but they don't invoke Sharia law. In fact, I think most of them did not. But in this conflict between those who want more freedom and those who are in power, there's always this group that is offering a third recipe, the Islamists, the political Muslims, the Medina-type Muslims, who are saying, see, the answer does not lie in the dictatorship. We've suffered under these dictatorships for all these decades. The answer does not lie in these Western isms that are foreign to us, but the answer for peace and prosperity and glory lies in Islamic law. And so it is definitely intra-Islamic. It has other causes, or many causes, but the Medina Muslims are offering a prescription that, in my view, is not a path to peace, but a path to internal repression and external aggression. But you're definitely right. It is not intra-Muslim fighting is not only religious fighting. It is a conflict between those in the cities and those in the rural areas. It's a conflict between haves and have-nots. It's a conflict between people who have more of a modern or modernized worldview and those with a traditional worldview. But the interesting thing, the key thing, is to look at what these Medina Muslims are offering, how big they are, and how they go about establishing themselves as the source of power. And so in that sense, the Medina Muslims are the most violent of them all. Do I think that through these conflicts and wars that ultimately is going to yield a reformation and possibly an enlightenment? Because I think really what we're talking about is an enlightenment. From the time that ISIS came on the scene, after the Arab Spring, and as these autocrats are waking up to the influence among the populations of the Medina Muslims, it seems to me as if they're having a reflection on Islam itself. And this is probably happening behind closed doors. But one thing that came out, take the Egyptian president, al-Sisi. He goes to an institution of Islam that for decades, for centuries, has been propagating the Medina ideology and tells them we need a revolution in religion. It doesn't mean that they've listened to him, but it means that here is a leader of a major Muslim country who is urging a reflection on religion itself. The UAE has done the same. So that would be a sort of top-down. The Saudis and the Gulf countries are trying to reflect on how can we contain these Medina Muslims and at the same time stay in power. That's not going to happen, and that in a way is going to force the situation either to a Reformation and enlightenment or to civil war. And they know that. But there's also that bottom-up. And I'm sorry Nassim left, but Iran is an interesting place here where the regime is more Islamic, more theocratic than the population. Population in the last uprising, 2009, you saw young women in jeans with their nail polish and letting their little bits of locks of hair showing from the headscarf. It's not a chador. It wasn't a chador. They weren't wearing chadors in that demonstration with lipstick. In Iran, that's how you protest. And you see more of these symbolic protests where people who have lived under Sharia law are coming out and saying, sorry, but we don't think this is a wonderful political philosophy in practice, and are disappointed and disenchanted with them. And that could also lead, ultimately, I would think if the top-down and the bottom-up meets somewhere in the middle, that could lead to a forcing of a reformation and possibly an enlightenment.
Thank you very much. Three brief comments. Firstly, the Mecca-Medina Muslim division. How much of a construct is that? By which I'm not saying that it's not useful,
Yeah.
but do people actually identify, by which I'm thinking of important leaders? I know, of course, of the distinction. I've heard debates about it, but when I myself take part in meetings with Islamic scholars, I very rarely hear that distinction. So I'd like just to give a quick comment on that. Secondly, I read an account by the Canadian political scientist Barry Cooper. It's called New Political Religions. It's inspired by Eric Voegelin, German-American historian and philosopher, who analyzed essentially many totalitarian, authoritarian movements as what he called Gnostic. As many will know here, that's been debated a lot. Is that a good term or is it not? But its idea is basically when you take the hope of something transcendent and immanentize it, so you do what he called immanentize the eschaton, that's when the danger happens. And his point seems to be that that is a temptation that exists across religions and worldviews and ideologies. So while some may lend themselves more to that, and some historical periods may lend itself more to that, it's not necessarily the essence of Islam. It can happen also in Christian civilization, it has happened, and of course in the Western world with totalitarian communism and National Socialism, which were essentially atheistic versions of that, where you immanentize the idea of the end state and put it into this world. So my question to you, I guess, would be whether Islam, in your view, and especially what you call Medina Islam, lends itself more easily to that because, as you claim, it's more of a political religion. And my final comment is that, unfortunately, for familial reasons, I will have to leave tonight. I hope to be here for the final session, but I just want to say thank you to Austin and Ralph for letting me be here, and good luck with the rest of the conference. That's it. Thank you.
So the first question, do Muslims identify themselves as, oh, I'm a Medina Muslim, or I'm a Mecca, or I'm a modifier? No, they don't do that. What I have done is first look at, what in trying to understand this problem of political Islam, radical Islam, Islamism. What does the literature say about it? And it's a lot, it's huge. You get at some point to a classification of not only Muslims, but Wahhabis and Salafis and quietist Salafis and violent Salafis, and then there's another little group in between there, and then there are the Ansaris, and it's bewildering. It's bewildering. So in trying to, you approach the problem and you think, okay, it's a major world religion, it's a civilization, how do I make sense of this? And what is it that is interesting to us? Why are we talking about Islam and conflict? Who is behind this conflict? And what I find within Muslim discussions among scholars, those who tried to reform over centuries, was take Muhammad Mahmud Taha in Sudan, 1980s. And he's trying to argue that it is possible to be a Muslim and to have a secular nation state that observes human rights, and we should accept equality between men and women. And so conceptually, how does he do that? He starts to say, well, what happened in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad's first wife, she was a businesswoman and she had her own whatever. And Muhammad, in the beginning, he brought a religion. It was about spirituality. And what happened in Medina, and he describes that in detail, and he says that is something that we should read in context. He doesn't go so far as I do to say, let's repudiate that and let's accept it and reject it. He gets killed. He's hanged in Sudan for apostasy. And he's not the only one. There were many before him, and there are many after him. There's Abdullah al-Na'im somewhere in the United States now, who also argues for a Mecca. Because what all these scholars are trying to do is, how can you remain a Muslim and not throw a 1400-year civilization out of the window, while at the same time progress and modernize and lead a tolerant life? And so ultimately, whoever does that comes to the conclusion that following Muhammad in his example in Medina is disastrous, and that's what needs to be rejected. But Muslims don't identify themselves as Meccans or Medinans, but from a scholarly perspective, I think these are labels that matter because it goes straight to the heart of the problem, which is Muhammad and his biography in Medina and his legacy in Medina. The other and you hear this a lot, all totalitarian ideologies, somehow, even though they are secular, and some of them are, in fact, communism, Marxism was atheist or anti-religion, but somehow they do have this, they have this temptation to spiritualize or transcend or bring something above it. That is true, and that is true for the Islamists of the day. I think Saddam Hussein tried to do that. But Islam is also different because from the very beginning, again from Medina onwards, Islam wasn't only a religion. And if you look at the discussions now between Islamic scholars on what to do about ISIS, they sit together, many of them, and say, let's condemn ISIS. But how can we condemn ISIS? What ISIS is saying is in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, and so on and so forth. And then they get to that point where, so is Islam politics and a political doctrine, or is it just a religion? And those ones who say that it's just a religion are silenced somehow or the other. Islam is a political doctrine. And I think when we talk about a reformation in Islam or an enlightenment in Islam, the first step is going to be a separation of religion from politics.
Then the final question of the day, Udo.
Bruno.
Sorry, Bruno. Bruno first.
It's going to be quick because my point's been raised more or less by Christian. I was struck, first of all, congratulations for your positive mentions of Huntington, which are very unusual these days, but I think that his book was full of interesting insight. Yeah. But I was troubled by your juxtaposition of Huntington and the IISS data, because the most oft-quoted sentence of Huntington was, quote, Islam has bloody borders, etc., which does have, some reality. The Caucasus, the Balkan, the 10th parallel in Africa, and all that. There was something that So this is more a comment in the interest of time. There won't be no questions. More a comment than a question. I was a bit troubled by your juxtaposition of the two, even though each of the 2 points you were making about Huntington and about that last figure are relevant in what you're saying. That's the question.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're both relevant. And I think Huntington's statement, very famous fast in his article in 1993 in Foreign Affairs, when he says Islam has bloody borders, and then he gets attacked from all sides, and then he comes with his book and he says, well, Islam doesn't only have bloody borders, it has also got bloody innards. And I think in that sense, if you just follow the facts, he's been vindicated. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting and fascinating. I would raise a question about Jews, Israel, Judaism. The division between Sunni and Shia Muslims doesn't really make much difference regard to Israel. I mean, some of the most anti-Israel and anti-Jews statements have in recent years have come from the leadership in Iran. And whereas among the Sunni states you will see different kinds of attitudes. So my question to you is whether these categories you suggest, the Medina Muslims, the Mecca and the modifiers, will also give different attitudes towards Jews, Israel, Semitism.
The modifying Muslims, I think one of the fascinating things about what they do is they start to say, let's stop blaming external factors for our internal problems, for our internal theological problems, political problems, cultural problems. And the biggest external scapegoat for leaders and populations is Israel and the Jews. And so they start to then write that they have no problems with a Jewish state in their midst, and then you know what happens. The reaction from Israelis is very often, oh my goodness, look, there is a Muslim here who is saying that they don't hate us, and start very quickly to establish relationships. I think the relationship between Jews and Christians in the long history is very problematic, but less problematic than, say, Christians and Jews. Muslims will say, we've only, or in Islamic history, again, the sources are Muslim. Jews, like Christians, were forced to pay the jizya. And early on, when Muhammad came to Medina and started waging war against Mecca, he had made a pact, a covenant, with 2 Jewish tribes. And the story is that they broke the covenant and betrayed him, and so he slaughtered them. And not only that, then it goes on in the Revelation or the Quran, it's taken on, do not take Jews among your friends, and wherever you see a Jew hiding, get him and kill him. And a lot of Medina Muslims invoke that and have revived that. The rejection of the state of Israel has always been a formal, I would say, state-led campaign. And not only was it state-led, but it was also embraced by the populations. And now we are at a place, paradoxically, where Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE are having behind-the-scenes talks with the state of Israel for their own survival. Saudi Arabia against Iran because they feel equally threatened in their very existence by ISIS and other radical groups that Saudi Arabia created. And so there's this relationship with Israel that is state-based, but the populations have not yet accepted that. And so when they talk about a peace process, it's going to be a process forever unless there's another campaign to the populations to accept an Israeli state amongst themselves. But that relates to the question on, do you think that these wars will force a reformation? And I think at some point, yes, if these elites feel that their existence depends on a reformation, and that reformation is going to, if it happens, and that enlightenment, if it happens, we will then see a change in the relationship between Muslims and Israel, and Muslims and Jews in general.
We have a final question here.
I had a comment when people talk about religion, Islam versus Christianity and Judaism. Judaism is law, basically. Law, and effectively we can see the same discrimination against outside people outside of the tribe. And the Bible has the same incitation to violence. Also, you see it's law. So when you move to Islam, Islam also is law. It's not Judaism. But Christianity is not law for the simple reason that Roman Empire had the law. So they say, okay, you guys can do whatever you want so long as you don't mess with Roman law. Even during the Inquisition, the church could not, they had still had to find a judge to sign off the paper because they still respected that separation. So we have a separation in Western society that we have inherited between law and things. And the clashes you see today between Judaism, between Islam and the Western world are very similar to the clashes between the Jews and the Romans. Okay, what they're doing, trying to dictate the law. That's the problem. So this is why, so once people put it to that framework, they understand that Islam is law. So unless you change the law, you're not going to be able to do anything. And this is where the Ayatollahs can change the law, and they said they're ready to change the law to modernize.
Islam is definitely a law, a system of law, that's Sharia. But it's also more than just a law. I think it starts with being a political philosophy that is said to be divine. And so I think a key difference between, say, Jewish law and Islamic law or Islam is that the Jews did not proselytize, they did not conquer, they didn't have, and I'm not an expert on Judaism by any means, but it seems to me as if they didn't get an order from their God to bring everyone under Judaism, whereas in Islam that is a key component.
To kill everybody, to do ethnic cleansing. Kill everybody in Judea to make sure it's clean, so when we criticize religion, the text we got to put it in context.
Listen, there are definitely similarities and differences, but the contemporary Islam, as the Medina Muslims see it now, they see it as their mandate to bring the rest of the world under Islam, not just Judea, not some small piece of the planet, but the entire planet. And there's this apocalyptic approach that they have that may exist in Judaism, it may exist in Christianity and other religions, but in its contemporary expression today in 2016, I think what we are seeing is definitely an obstacle to peace within the world that is Muslim majority and in relation to non-Muslim countries.